Hello and welcome to another episode of The State of Politics. I am your host, Declan McConville, and as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Patrick McGilp. Today, we are delighted to be joined by another person from the University of Strathclyde, not a student like us two, the top man from the University of Strathclyde's Politics Department, I would say, Professor Sir John Curtice. John, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you very much.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. So, just to kick off, people will see you a lot on TV during elections, but how did you first get into politics and how have you ended up arriving at the point you're at as a professor at University of Strathclyde?
Well, I mean, that's a mixture of the traditional and the perhaps somewhat less traditional. The academic path is reasonably straightforward. A-levels down south. I then get into Oxford, do philosophy, politics and economics at Oxford, concentrating primarily on politics. I then move across to another college in Oxford, which is a graduate college for social scientists at Nuffield, and became a graduate student there. I then actually moved back to my old Oxford college for a while, acting as a temporary tutor because my former tutor had gone off to do a admin job, and I kind of went to and fro between that and then got a temporary junior postdoctoral fellowship. Got a post eventually at University of Liverpool, and about 5 years after that, and more than 30 years ago now, got a post at Strathclyde, where I eventually have stayed. So that's just pretty standard academic pathway. The journalism side really comes because my graduate supervisor was Sir David Butler, who was one of the two people, together with Bob Mackenzie, who made election night television on the BBC in the 1950s what it came to be. So he was already somebody who, by the time I was being supervised by him, was already a well and truly well-versed teledon. And for the 1979 election, he said, I need somebody behind me, because David didn't fully then trust the large mainframe computers on which we were by that stage reliant for calculating the statistics of the election. And my job, because I picked up a bit of programming as a graduate student, was to program a programmable calculator so that it would calculate the swing in a constituency as and when it was declared, so that even if the computer went on the blink, we still had the statistics that David wanted. Actually, the computer didn't go on the blink all night, but I still got the chance to sit behind him in my first introduction to election night television. After that, another person involved in BBC Behind, who actually ran the software on the BBC's mainframe computer to try to predict what was going to happen. He and I persuaded the BBC that it should be using a very early microcomputer to be taking in, ingesting and reporting the results of the 1981 Greater London Council election, from which emerged BBC's coverage of local elections thereafter, being informed by statistical analysis. We did something similar for the 1983 election. So that therefore meant I then became pretty much a permanent fixture, not so much front of camera, but behind the camera. So far as the BBC is concerned, a position I've occupied ever since. And then the first person I collaborated with academically was somebody called Michael Steed, who was also, as well as being an active politician actually inside the Liberal Party, was also something of a teledon. He was well used to getting stuff into the media, etc. We wrote quite a lot about the formation of the Liberal-SDP alliance, and I think my first interview on Newsnight in 1981 was about how that pact might be operationalized. So you can see that basically, so far as the becoming somebody who did television, etc., that was really the product very much of the kinds of people with whom I was working with and interacting with relatively early in my career. But this, in some sense, is entirely separate from the academic pathway.
When it comes to the exit poll and opinion polls in the election, you're interviewing, I think it's 10,000 or 20,000 different people before every election. Can you talk us through the process of how you choose your constituencies, your polling stations, and what the sort of process is for coming up with a seat-by-seat projection every single election, and obviously how accurate it's been over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a project whose methodology has changed somewhat over time, and I've only really begun to get involved in that part of the BBC's coverage in the 1990s, and really it was in 2005 in particular that the methodology that we're currently using was set down. And that was something that was very much, it was an idea basically that came from David Firth, who's a statistician at Warwick. And his basic argument was exit polls in the UK, as we've seen from our own experience, very, very difficult to do, very difficult to get right. And one essential reason why they're very difficult to get right is because we don't have polling station counts in the UK. In most countries, you count the vote by polling station, and only after you've counted the votes do you take the security risk of transporting these ballot boxes and voting papers to a central location for safe tabulation and keeping. In the UK, in contrast, we think nothing about having ballot boxes wandering around the country at 2 o'clock in the morning in the dark, arriving safely at a central count before anybody has counted how many ballot papers are in the boxes or done anything to check that what was ending up in the counting centre actually corresponds to what was balloted in the polling station. That's just the way things have worked out. But that does therefore mean it's impossible. Any exit poll has to be based on a sample of polling stations, a relatively small, geographically concentrated sample. And because you don't know whether or how any sort of polling stations voted last time, it's very difficult to come up with a sample that's politically representative. We tried, but with limited success. So what David argued, and we persuaded not just the BBC but also ITV, because they decided to do it jointly, was that rather than trying yet again to come up with an even better sample of constituencies, we just took the sample that we had. And the two organisations had their own exit polls that were going to be amalgamated. So in a sense, we therefore just had the accident of what had historically been covered. And the argument was we no longer tried to use the exit poll to estimate the level of support for the parties, but only to estimate the changes in their support. And the argument is that, yes, support for the parties varies dramatically from one part of the country to another. The changes in their support since the last election do also vary from one part of the country to another, but they don't vary anything like as much. Ergo, there is a greater probability that any sample of polling stations is going to be more accurate in the information it gives you about the change in party support than it does the level. So that's what it's used for. It's used to calculate the change, and we can calculate the change if we go back wherever possible to the same polling stations as we did last time. And that's the essence of the methodology. It's literally going back to the same old places again. We know how they voted last time from the last exit poll. We now find out how they're doing this time. And that basically gives us about 140 estimates of change in party support. In polling stations whose constituency, we know what constituency they're in. We know a lot about the constituencies. And from that, we can begin to model the changes in party support in order to come up basically with equations that say, if a constituency has these characteristics, we expect the Conservative vote to be up by X, the SNP vote to be down by Y, etc. Now, it's been a bit more complicated than that over time. The character of party competition has changed. We've had to increase the number of constituencies in Scotland. We also had to increase at one point the number of constituencies that UKIP were fighting, and that's forced us to go down a much more difficult process of trying to find good polling stations that perhaps mimic the constituency they're in. But that's basically it. So the answer to your question, where did we go? Where we went last time. What are we estimating? Change in party support. We're then using that to come up with some statistical models of how the change in support will happen in each and every constituency. There's then another little bit of statistical jiggery-pokery whereby, if we get if our equations say that in the constituency it's 40% Conservative, 40%, 39% Labour, we don't say, oh, well, the Conservatives are going to win that constituency. We basically say, well, the Conservatives have probably got about 52% chance of winning that constituency, Labour 48%. And the actual forecast total number of seats for the parties that gets broadcast at 10 o'clock at night is actually the sum of the probabilities for each party winning each seat. So it's not a 1-0 forecast. It's basically, so if the Conservatives are forecast to have a 0.5 chance of winning two constituencies, we basically say, well, they'll win one of them and they won't win the other one. That's it.
John, obviously you covered both general elections and Scottish elections, and you've touched on their exit polls in UK parliamentary elections. The amount of people that were asking the question only a couple of weeks ago, when is the exit poll going to be out at 10 o'clock, and it doesn't happen. Do you think we could ever see a point where there is ever a Scottish exit poll, and how would that carry out? Would it be very similar to the way it's done on a UK parliamentary scale, or would it be different, obviously, because the voting system is different? Would we just break down those first 73 seats into the first past the post seats to see what kind of picture we would get? But obviously the list can then change that.
Well, I mean, the answer to is that you would probably essentially do it the same. It's a little bit easier to do in Scotland in that one of the features of our local elections, exceptionally, is that they do give us polling station counts, because the local elections are counted electronically and they're counted ballot box by ballot box, which is not true of the hand counting of general elections. And because of the way it's electronic counting, the parties cannot do their own hand tally of ballot box by ballot box, which was what they can do when the ballot boxes are initially opened, not to be counted, but to verify the total number of ballot papers in the ballot box. Therefore, we have legislation that basically means you now have each polling station voted. So you would probably use that. Indeed, we have used that information to get new polling stations for Scotland for the general election. But otherwise, I think the methodology would be the same. But of course, the one disadvantage you've got is that because we've not done an exit poll in the past, estimating change first time around will be more problematic. But the essential reason why it doesn't happen is to do with money. It's very expensive to do an exit poll. The broadcasters just about reckon it's worth the six-figure sum involved in doing it for a general election. They do not make the same calculation for a devolved election. That even with Wales covers no more than 15% of the UK, particularly as the devolved elections take place alongside other elections which the broadcasters are also covering at that same time. Now, I suspect that therefore means that probably the honest answer to your question is that we probably will never get an exit poll in Scotland unless and until Scotland becomes an independent country. Now, that's not an argument for independence on my part. That's probably just a statement of fact, though even then, the broadcasting companies in Scotland would have to dig very deeply into their financial resources. And of course, they will not have the same degree of financial resources as the UK broadcasting organisations would have. The question was quite serious, as you might imagine, the question was seriously raised for the Scottish independence referendum. Because that was thought to be of major significance for the UK. It may well, as a whole, not just for Scotland, it may well get raised again if we get another referendum. Trouble is, as you now know enough to know, we couldn't use exactly the same methodology So it's potentially difficult. I can see ways of doing it, but the other thing that the broadcasters, and this is again the realpolitik of the situation, doing an exit poll for an election or a referendum which is very close is always highly problematic and very risky. And in part, it was a very simple calculation in 2014. If we do a pretty good exit poll and we say it's 51% for yes, and in the end it's 49%, well, statistically, that's pretty good. It's about as much as you might reasonably expect out of an exit poll. But of course, because you've called it wrong, and you've called it so wrong over something that's so crucial, something that's so market sensitive, it's a very, very substantial political risk for any broadcasting organization to take. So I'm afraid that's also the other calculation that to some extent at least tends to govern these things.
Is that why there wasn't one for Brexit either? Because it was so close for so long, and also you're calculating the rate of change. There had never been an exit poll for an EU referendum.
To be honest, I don't ever remember anybody thinking it was worth doing one for Brexit. Maybe my memory's forgotten. What we knew we could all do, and all the broadcasting organisations did. What we knew that we could do was that because, particularly Chris Hanratty, now Royal Holloway, had done a lot of work on the geography of the Brexit vote, we knew that we could, and support for Brexit, we knew that we could come up with very good estimates of what the level of support for Brexit would likely to be in an individual local authority if the result was 50-50. And that therefore enabled us to create a benchmark to say, well, early result, from Sunderland, well, what do we make of it? Well, what we make of it is that this is somewhat more pro-Leave than we would expect if it was going to be a 50-50 result. Ergo, early indication that this means that the country is heading in a Leave direction. Indeed, the markets picked that message up very, very quickly. So I think it was the fact that we reckoned that through statistical modelling of existing data, we could come up with a good estimate of what the result was going to be in a local authority when it was declared. That therefore meant that the broadcasters had what they needed in order to make sense of the early results. Because you have to bear in mind that, in a sense, one of the purposes of an exit poll is to provide a benchmark to say, look, this is what we think is going to happen. And therefore, and if this exit poll is right, this is roughly what we think will happen in Sunderland South or wherever are the early declarations. And it is the difference that there is or isn't between the early declarations as anticipated by the exit poll and the overall forecast of the exit poll that basically gives you your guide as to whether or not how the election is falling out. And in the end, it doesn't matter if the exit poll is wrong for this purpose. What matters is that it gives you an indication of what the meaning of the early results are going to be as they start to be declared. So I think with Brexit, in a sense, we didn't need the prop of an exit poll in order to be able to do that kind of interpretation pretty accurately, pretty early on.
To move on, John, from exit polls and Brexit and stuff, to kind of touch on the most recent Scottish election. I know you've did a bit of data and research in the past couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. First of all, the first thing I was going to touch on was, there's been a lot of rhetoric from pro-unionist parties that there is not a mandate in the Scottish referendum because they make up, Scottish referendum, for a referendum as the makeup of the Parliament hasn't changed as much. We still see a minority SNP government propped up by the Greens. Do you think that has changed because there was a clear promise made in both parties' manifestos, the Scottish National Party and the Greens, that they would hold a referendum? Do you think the Unionists have any argument really here to stand on?
Well, I think the answer to that question is that the position is not the same as it was in 2016, but equally it's not an election whose interpretation necessarily simply fulfills and confirms the accuracy of the claims made by either side in this debate. So let's take it at various stages. The first point, I think it is first perfectly reasonable to make, is that whereas in 2016 the SNP manifesto said, well, we think that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to decide when we have a referendum, but we really don't expect to want to hold one unless either the polls have really changed or there's been a material change of circumstance, such as Scotland being forced out of the EU against its will. So it was a rather more contingent promise. And of course, it was open to interpretation as to what was a material change in circumstance, albeit Brexit was cited as a possible example. But of course, unionists didn't necessarily have to agree that that was necessarily a valid example. This time around, it's perfectly clear. The SNP is saying that we think the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold a referendum at its time of choosing, and we are seeking your permission to hold such a referendum. And the Greens were saying the same thing. So I think, what was said in the manifesto is less ambiguous. And, by the conventional rules of our politics, which is that if you get a parliamentary majority in favour of a supposition, then we think that those parties do indeed have a mandate to pursue that supposition. The Conservative Party was able to pursue Brexit after 2019, even though they had well under less than half the vote, because under the rules of the game, they had a parliamentary majority. It's a little less clear in the Scottish Parliament because, of course, it is the two parties together that have a majority rather than the SNP on their own. The SNP on having a majority on their own would have been even clearer. But even so, you've still got a parliamentary majority. However, it is a parliamentary majority that, like the one in 2019, is a reflection of the electoral system rather than the balance of support. In 2019, of course, only around 47% of people voted for a party that was in favour of implementing Brexit. 52% voted for a party that was willing to back a second referendum. It's just that the second of those votes was much more fragmented, ergo the Leave side won. Here, and in 2021, well, 50.1% of the vote on the constituency vote goes to the three main unionist parties. So 50.4% goes to the three main unionist parties. But on the list vote, 50.1% goes to the three main nationalist parties. So if you want to use the criterion of the share of the vote, well, frankly, it's a score draw. It's therefore not, it's neither can be said it is clear that Scotland voted against having a referendum, nor can it be said that it's clear that the election demonstrated that Scotland definitely wanted a referendum. Rather, what the election did in terms of votes was to confirm that Scotland's just divided down the middle on the issue of independence and on the issue of referendum, because, yes, it is true, most people who voted for the SNP were yes supporters. Most yes supporters want a referendum at least at some point in the next 5 years, and all the converse is true on the no side. But the electoral system did operate to the advantage of the SNP, partly because the party won in some regions more constituency seats than its proportionate share, and also because we use an allocation formula that is not the most proportional. If we had simply had a system of PR and a more proportionate system of allocation, we would have ended up with 65 pro-independent seats, as you might think should be the case so far as the seats are concerned. But we are where we are, and where we are under the rules of the game is that we have a pro-independence, pro-referendum majority inside the Scottish Parliament. And whatever the arguments about the rights and wrongs of that, politically, we have a government that was elected by voters who are in favour of yes and are in favour of having a referendum. and it is therefore as politically impossible for this government not to pursue a referendum as it has been for Boris Johnson not to pursue Brexit since December 2019. Both the UK government and the Scottish government are very much now bound to the constitutional projects on which they secured victory in their respective election campaigns.
When it comes to sort of the hegemony that we've seen in the three elections, the Tories totally dominating in England, Labour dominating Wales for the 22 years there's been devolution, and the SNP in the past 14 years. What do you think are the main causes of that? Because you could say the constitution in Scotland and England, but maybe not in Wales. And how quickly can that change? Because I don't think polls change all that quickly in British politics. I think 1992 with the exchange rate mechanism was the only example I could think of. How quickly could that change for the three parties?
Well, you're right. The exchange rate mechanism saw a dramatic change. I mean, any sterling crisis causes the incumbent government a great deal of difficulty. Yes, we have three different governments with three different stripes, three rather different party systems in the three parts of the UK. Not sure that the developments are in any way connected. I mean, the success of the Conservative Party, the current success of the Conservative Party in England, is intimately bound up with Brexit. Right, the Conservative Party is very heavily dependent on Leave voters. It's got 3/4 of the Leave vote in England, at least. It's got lower proportions in Wales and particularly in Scotland. And given that the Remain vote is fragmented, that enables the Conservative Party to win the election in 2019. It's partly Brexit in 2017. I mean, it's just the whole sequence of developments since 2001 that's enabled the Conservative Party to become the largest party in England. And it's going to remain in that position unless and until the link between voting support for Leave and voting for the Conservative Party is broken, which it may or may not at some point in the future. In Wales, well, I mean, the Conservative Party has never won an election in Wales since the advent of the mass franchise. And there is a constitutional division in Wales, but it's a constitutional division that creates a space for a party in the middle. So yes, Wales does have a nationalist party, but it's a nationalist party that is as much bound up with support for the Welsh language as it is for Welsh independence stroke more autonomy for Wales, and the level of support for independence is much lower than it is in Scotland. Wales does have its pro-Brexit party, its strong unionist party, which is the Conservatives, much as in Scotland, but a lot of the Conservative support in Wales is not just unionist, but it's Devo-sceptic, because just over 25% of people in Wales say they'll vote to get rid of the Assembly, the Senedd. So what you find is that in Wales, the Conservative Labour Party actually in the Senedd election got more support amongst supporters of independence than did Plaid. So whereas in Scotland, support for independence and voting for the SNP is synonymous. In Wales, it is not, right? And that's partly to do with the language issue. It's partly also Labour Party can articulate some of the Remain vote in Wales. But it's also that the reach of the Conservative Party in Wales is also to some degree limited by its association with scepticism about devolution. And therefore, the Labour Party is also doing relatively well amongst unionist voters as well. So it's a party, therefore, that bridges. Because in the end, the most popular constitutional stance in Wales is devolution, maybe a little bit more of it, but using devolution to stand up for Wales's interests. That is still the majority position in Wales. Therefore, there is a place for a party that plays the card of the dragon, has promoted Wales' interests in the Senedd ever since 1999, and manages to maintain its position, even though it does find it more difficult to do one in Senedd elections than it does in parliamentary elections in Wales, when the Plaid's challenge is much weaker. But it's therefore able to prosper. Now, in Scotland, the position is completely different. I mean, the dominance of the SNP, well, I mean, originally the SNP came to power because, well, I mean, a bit of luck in 2007. Tony Blair stayed, remained prime minister for slightly too long. The Labour Party was not that popular UK-wide. The SNP just get in. In 2011, they make it because people think that they were much better able to provide effective devolved government for Scotland. People thought they'd done quite well over the previous 4 years. The Labour Party fought an awful campaign, and there was just a remarkable movement towards the SNP during the campaign. A lot of it amongst people who opposed independence. Nearly 40% of people who were opposed to independence voted for the SNP in 2011. In 2016, support by this stage, support for independence is higher. The independence referendum had destroyed Labour's Westminster base. So by this stage, therefore, the referendum is beginning to shape things. So these are three different stories. If there's any connection between them, Brexit is a bit of a connection between them. And certainly it's Brexit which has resulted in the dominance of the Conservatives in England. And it is Brexit that's basically put the whole constitutional question back on the agenda in Scotland, with some of the consequences being in the 2021 election. But there's a lot of other differences going on in the meantime between the three parts of the UK.
John, you spoke about Welsh Labour being that kind of middle ground party that people can turn to on both sides. And you said earlier that Scotland as a country is completely split down the middle.
Yeah.
On Scottish Labour's position, it appeared that Anna Sarwar in this election was trying to kind of draw people back into the middle, saying we want to talk about recovery, but a party that represents everybody. How do you think now, having failed, because Labour didn't get in as opposition, they can't for the next 5 years give an alternative government, how does Scottish Labour recover at all while Scotland operates as part of the United Kingdom?
Well, I mean, this is part of a wider question, because the dilemma that's facing Scottish Labour is simply a more acute version of the one facing the party across the UK as a whole. And there are really two aspects to it. I mean, the first is that, the truth is the Labour Party is much more comfortable. People who join the Labour Party, people who vote for the Labour Party, are for the most part people who are primarily concerned about the level of inequality in our society and want to see government do something about it. They are comfortable talking about the politics of left versus right. They are, for the most part, not people who came into politics in order to talk about constitutional questions. You go and join the Liberal Democrats or the SNP if you want to talk about constitutional change. And they're also not comfortable dealing with the question of Europe, which is basically another constitutional question that's bound up with identity, etc., etc. And where the division is not a division between left and right, but between social liberals and social conservatives. The stance of the Labour Party since Brexit was implemented has essentially been, we're going to keep stum about Brexit. We're not going to say anything about it. It's been done. We hope that politics is going to move on, and therefore we say little about it. The trouble is that's not where the electorate are at. The lesson of the local elections in England, south of the border, was that Brexit still very, very heavily structures support for the Conservatives and support for the Labour Party, and does so in a way that certainly when the Conservatives are overall ahead in the polls is going to do the Labour Party an awful lot of damage. But equally, in Scotland, if the central question that voters were dividing on, and did divide on, was the constitutional question, it's very difficult to say that you don't have a stance on the constitutional question. In the end, of course, the Labour Party did. its stance was we're in favour of not having a referendum and staying in the Union, albeit then not being quite so clear what it might say thereafter. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem, which again Scottish Labour is very similar to UK Labour, insofar as the UK Labour Party wants politics to go back to left versus right. One of the difficulties it faces is that it faces a UK Conservative government, which is not the neoliberal kind of government that we have been used to from Conservative parties since 1979. Even before the pandemic, we were looking at a government that, at least so far as capital spending is concerned, is much more interventionist in its ideology, at least so far as the Prime Minister is concerned, than were previous governments before it, and it's willing to spend money on infrastructure as a way of trying in its view to level up and improve the productive capacity of the economy. It's therefore not a case of fighting a government that was willing to engage in fiscal rectitude, in austerity, etc., in the wake of the financial crash. That was not the position of this government. So opening up the space, the distinctive space, about what the Labour Party is going to stand for in a post-pandemic world facing a very different kind of Conservative government is much more difficult. Equally, one of the reasons it was very, very difficult to persuade voters in Scotland to vote on the basis of the vision of the pandemic and what kind of things should be done for post-pandemic public policy is that when it came to that, 9 times out of 10, you just played a game of snap. In other words, all the parties, unionist and nationalist, were pretty much saying the same thing. More spending on the health service, particularly on mental health, reducing the attainment gap, more spending on nurses, making sure we keep our medical professionals. Very, very difficult for voters to identify difference. There's a bit of a difference on the idea of a national care service, but that's a little tiny bit on taxation. Labour saying, well, we might just possibly tax people a bit more, and the Conservatives saying we might just possibly tax people a little bit less, maybe just before the next election, but that was it. So it's very difficult for voters to distinguish. So again, if you're going to try to persuade people to vote on a different set of issues, you've got to have a distinctive position. And the Labour Party here, and it was not alone, did not have a distinctive position. Ergo, not surprising that these domestic issues were ones that at the end of the day did not seem to make much difference to how people voted, including for the Labour Party.
When it comes to Labour in England, I mean, it's a different challenge in Scotland and Wales. But when it comes to Labour in England, I think people have referred to the Conservatives as the most successful political party of all time. Not only that, it's a first-past-the-post electoral system. I think it's, when you compare it to EU countries, it's the only country that uses first-past-the-post. And I think there's going to be boundary changes before the next general election.
Yeah.
Is it an uphill battle in just about every single election for anyone apart from the Conservatives, mainly Labour because of the official opposition, every time they're out of power to get back into power?
Well, yes and no. Of course, it's true the Conservatives won far more elections than the Labour Party has managed to do. That's not necessarily because the electoral system has always operated to Labour's disadvantage. It's quite often operated to Labour's advantage. That was certainly true, and one of the good fortunes of Tony Blair's government, that at that time the electoral system was operating to Labour's advantage. Labour's problem now, however, is that it's lost Scotland. So that was a distinct advantage that it had that's now being lost. And at the moment, the geography of party support means that Labour's vote is less efficiently distributed. But that's something that changes from election to election and time to time. Though it will, again, probably need to be Brexit to no longer to be as important in our voting as it is at present. So, I mean, I remember lots of people after the 1992 election saying Labour's bound to lose, and people were talking about the UK as a one-party state, and I think I even contributed to a book whose title was Turning Japanese, which was a reference to the dominance at that stage of the Liberal Democrat Party in Japan. Well, of course, within 6 months of the 1992 election, as we've already referred to, Britain crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism, and the rest is history. We had a very sorry Conservative government that basically just headed and limped towards defeat for the next 4.5 years, and did so in spectacular fashion. So there's no guarantee about these things, and a lot of our politics now, I mean, apart from in the end, what's our long-term evaluation about the Conservatives' handling of the pandemic, which obviously is something of a mixed record at the moment. Pretty horrendous at the beginning, but much more successful at this point in time, but still potentially problematic, is going to be what we make of Brexit. I mean, that's going to be this government's signature policy. And whether we do or do not, particularly whether or not Leave voters do or do not think that Brexit has been a success, is going to be pretty important. And who knows what's going to happen. A lot of the consequences of Brexit are currently still largely hidden because of the pandemic. And it may be a while before we work out whether it is, what differences it is or it didn't make. So, there's nothing inevitable about politics. But certainly, the Labour Party does have some pretty serious problems to face. It does have to work out how to deal with Brexit and how it's going to try to overcome the Conservatives' dominance of the Leave vote. But it also just more broadly, it needs a message. I mean, the Labour Party at the moment seems bereft of direction. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter whether it comes up with a Corbynite direction or a Blairite direction or something in between. It needs a sense of direction. And one of the questions, in a sense, that's now being asked about Sir Keir Starmer is that, yes, he's a very clever lawyer. As a very clever lawyer, he's very good at challenging the evidence being given by the chief prosecution witness, but being a political leader is not simply about meeting the terms of a brief that's already been written. It's also about writing your own brief. And the question that Sir Keir Starmer now needs to demonstrate is that he can write a brief for his party that begins to get his party enthused, begins to get voters enthused about it as being a potential alternative to the current incumbent government. Now, the pandemic's not made any of that easier, and arguably that is a partial explanation as to why the party is where it is. But, the lesson of the last 12 months is you can harry the government on competence for quite a while. You can get some of the way with that, but if then the government all of a sudden does something rather well, all of a sudden you're back to square one.
That bounce has probably came obviously from vaccine rollout again, even though Labour were very critical of the Tories that on pandemic handling, that they probably did have that bounce from the vaccine across the UK and Wales, Scotland and England. It's been the case of going with the tried and tested, John. So it will be interesting to see how that reflects in our next general election. Onto that, Labour, as you said rightly, had a very clear identity under Jeremy Corbyn. It was very different from a Blair government. It was very, what people were describing, even very left wing. Do you think that strategy could ever work for Labour again, or do you think? Well, again,
I challenge the premise of your question a bit. I mean, I would say two things. 2017, pretty mild manifesto. Problem in 2019, as so often, lots of policy detail, but very little in the way of a synoptic message. I'll give you one little cameo of this, which was I was doing The World Tonight during the 2019 election, and Annalise Dodds, who's now Shadow Cabinet Office Minister and was the Shadow Chancellor for a while. And I said to Annalise Dodds, look, can you sum up for us what is Labour Party's message for this election? And the answer was, we're in favour of delivering better public services. Well, that tells you nothing, right? That's not a distinctive message. Everybody's in favour of better public services. So the truth is, whereas the Conservative Party has a clear message, get Brexit done, Labour did not have a clear message. So it might have a lot of radical policies, but it wasn't, the sum was less, the whole was less than the sum of the parts. And at the end of the day in politics, what matters is not policy detail, but it's the broad synoptic message with which you give voters. And at the end of the day, Labour arguably was too concerned about the detail of policy rather than the broad synoptic message. And ironically, for a party leader that was meant to be distinctively left-wing and ideological, I'm not sure he was able to convey what his distinctive left-wing ideological position actually was. Not least, of course, because on Brexit, which was the central issue of the election, Labour continued to prevaricate, still had an uncertain position, etc., etc.
When it comes to independence, John, you hear a lot of SNP politicians talk about how if Boris Johnson doesn't grant a Section 30 order, it will just drive up support for independence. But what comes to my mind anyway was, if he doesn't grant an independence referendum, it doesn't really matter if support goes up or not, because there won't be a vote. Can you see, I don't want to get you to make a prediction, obviously you're bipartisan, can you see a referendum happening in the timescale that Nicola Sturgeon wants one to, or can Boris Johnson quite simply continue to say no?
Yeah, I can certainly paint you one very straightforward scenario as to why a referendum may well happen. If over the course of, let's say, the next 18 months, support for independence falls, and it looks as though that, as a result, there's a pretty good chance that the no side will win, Boris Johnson may calculate that indeed it's in his interest to accept the idea of a referendum. As I've already said, I think it's not. I think it's a promise that, much like David Cameron's promise of a referendum in 2015, Nicola Sturgeon won't be able to escape, and Boris says, "Be my guest." I mean, that after all was David Cameron's calculation back in 2011. David Cameron was not being some wonderful Democrat in 2011 saying, you know, hands up, we've lost, you've got the right to have a referendum. I mean, that was the public rhetoric, but the private reality was, yeah, okay, you said you wanted a referendum. Okay, fine. I know what the polls say. I know that we've got a good chance of getting 70% of the vote, and that will be it. Game over. Now, of course, it backfired. And of course, Boris, in making that calculation, it could backfire, but it might look like a reasonable risk. So that is arguably the most likely scenario. Equally, of course, if things move in the opposite direction and support for independence goes up, then the wish of the UK government to prevaricate, etc., is bound to become more intense. So we partly have to watch the polls. The difficulty the Unionist side face, however, in simply saying no, I think is twofold. One is, you know, there's a bit of a risk that support for independence might go up, though I don't push it too much, because I think you have to remember that most no voters don't want a referendum. So there may be a few who go, well, this really is a bit too far. And, you know, that might push support for independence back up to 52, 53%. I'm not sure it's going to cause an avalanche of support in the same way as Brexit never caused an avalanche of support. It only caused a gradual increase over quite a long period of time. The real difficulty I think they have to face is that if you make it clear that the outcome of a Scottish Parliament election is not going to create a potential pathway towards a democratic referendum on the issue, you then have to think, what conclusion does the SNP draw? And here I think it's worth bearing in mind as to why the SNP dreamt up the idea of having a referendum as the pathway to independence in the first place. And it was a strategy that, in part at least, was drawn out of electoral weakness. That is, the SNP wanted to find a way of persuading people to vote for the party, particularly in a devolved election, even though they were not in favour of independence. So therefore, the merits of an independence, much like Tony Blair's willingness to encapsulate the idea of a referendum on a Scottish Parliament in the 1990s, he wanted to push the issue out of an election. He was afraid that the issue of having a Scottish Parliament would compromise Labour's chances of winning the general election. So we parked the issue into referendum. Exactly the same way the SNP said, we're going to park the issue of independence and put it into a referendum. So therefore, dear unionist voter, you can vote for us safe in the knowledge that this doesn't mean independence, because you can then vote against the referendum. And indeed, as we've already said, this was a successful tactic above and above all in the 2011 Scottish Parliament election, where the SNP's success was founded on the back of the support of unionist voters. Now, it also says, from what we said earlier, is that those days are over. With support for independence at 50%, and with virtually everybody who's in favour of independence willing to vote for the SNP, again, something that historically has not been true, the fact that the other half of Scotland isn't willing to vote for the SNP anymore becomes irrelevant. It does therefore mean, however, that the promise of a referendum no longer brings the SNP an obvious electoral dividend, and that therefore the party can potentially contemplate going back to what it was its previous policy. And the SNP's previous policy was, if we win a majority of the Scottish seats at Westminster, we will regard that as a mandate to negotiate for independence, in much the same way as the fact that a majority of MPs from Ireland in 1918 were from Sinn Féin was accepted by the then UK government as evidence that Ireland should no longer simply have her own rule, which is what was originally envisaged, but should become independent, albeit then Ireland was, of course, partitioned into North and South. And so you have to worry, therefore, that this becomes the SNP position. You then certainly have to realise it's a lot easier for the SNP to win a majority of the Westminster seats at Westminster than it is to win 50% of the vote. They've never got 50% of the vote in the Westminster election. They were even slightly short in 2015. And then you have to worry about, well, what might the outcome of the next general election be? Well, still pretty high probability. There's a very wide range of results that potentially produce a hung parliament. Some of which results produce a hung parliament in which the only game in town is to be able to form a government with the help and support of the SNP. At which point, you're stuck. Because either you have to form a grand coalition, or certainly you've got to, the two parties have got to come to some understanding to allow the other one to form a minority administration. And that's going to be difficult. And meanwhile, the SNP can threaten to gum up the Westminster Works, and there's obviously plenty of opportunity for that. So you have to worry about what are the knock-on consequences. And those knock-on consequences could rebound. And I think, the honest truth is that in those circumstances, if we get another hung parliament, the Labour Party will be desperate to get back in power. And I think another referendum will, in those circumstances, will happen. The Labour Party will grant it. I mean, after all, the Labour Party doesn't have anything to lose. The Labour Party has much less to lose now about Scotland becoming independent than it had back before 2014. Scotland's already lost. So, hey guys, bearing in mind that the Faustian Pact will, for whoever is Labour leader at that point, Sir Keir Starmer or whoever he is, I either become Prime Minister, okay, I might lose Scotland, I might have to concede proportional representation, and I might have to do something about renegotiating the withdrawal treaty. Well, the last of those I may not find too uncomfortable. The second of those my party might already have come around to. And the first of those, frankly, is just the pact with the devil I'm going to make in order to become Prime Minister, in much the same way as David Cameron made a Faustian pact with the devil of his Liberal Democrats back in 2010, even though he was telling us all days before the election that a hung parliament was a recipe for chaos. At the end of the day, people who want to become Prime Minister will have to make all sorts of compromises. So that's the other scenario whereby it happens, but in circumstances that might be less favourable to the union's cause.
Do you think we're seeing a bit of a reflection of 2016 in that the pro-independence parties are quite, the vote is solidified behind the SNP, whereas the pro-unionist parties are completely split? They can't agree amongst themselves how to run the UK, never mind run Scotland. So it's a recipe already for disaster for them.
Well, I mean, what is certainly true is that the nationalist movement have a crucial strategic advantage. And its strategic advantage that's been retained thanks to the fact that the Alba project, so far at least, has not got off the ground. At the end of the day, the nationalism in Scotland, so far as its political representation is concerned, is largely united around the SNP, albeit with the Greens as relatively relatively accommodating outliers, whereas unionism is split. Unionism is split between Conservative and Labour, and to some degree the Liberal Democrats, and these parties do not agree about their vision for the union. It was a fundamental problem for the unionist side in 2014. It's why Project Fear dominated. It's why it was only at the last minute that they all signed up to the idea that they would come to a common platform together with the SNP about more devolution. Hitherto, they'd all been working on their own separate ideas for more devolution. And there is an interesting parallel here between that strategic situation and the one on Brexit. At the end of the day, the reason why Brexit was delivered was because Boris Johnson was able to unite the Leave vote very heavily behind the Conservative Party. The Remain vote, the Remain movement was divided between Norwayists, Norway pluses, Norway minuses, those who fancied the Swiss, those who wanted a second referendum on certain conditions or maybe other conditions. And the Remain vote was fragmented, and the rest is history. So, I mean, certainly Boris Johnson should be aware that the fragmentation of the unionist vote is to his disadvantage. It's, of course, one of the reasons why the Conservative Party were very keen to try to persuade unionists to vote for the Conservative Party. And they are the largest of the unionist parties, but we've still got a fragmented unionist movement north of the border, and I think that still places it at a strategic disadvantage.
On support for independence, John, it's obviously, as you go through the ages, it's highest amongst young people and lowest amongst older people. Is it true that as you get older, you become more conservative? And in this case, is it the case that as you become older, you might become more unionist? Or over time, is it true that independence will just be supported by 70% of the population, if not higher, if they waited for 50 years?
The answer is we don't know. We don't know the answer to that question because we don't have measures of independence over a sufficiently long time period. All that one can tell you is that support for independence is higher now than it was 20 years ago, and that increase in support is partly driven by a generational effect, i.e. that the people who've entered the electorate during the course of the last 20 years have been more in favour of independence than those who've left the electorate. But it's also been driven by a period effect, i.e. that people in all generations have got somewhat more in favour of independence, even though along the way that those generations have got older, right? So there's been a period effect, been a generation effect, but it's certainly been difficult so far to generate a age effect. But and it's very, very difficult to disentangle these things. Mathematically, at the end of the day, it's not possible to do so. So, we have to wait and see how things will pan out. The other thing one should say, however, is that the relationship between age and support for independence has strengthened over time. It's particularly strengthened in the wake of Brexit and in the wake of the fact that Brexit has become much more linked towards attitudes towards independence. And because Brexit in particular is something that's supported by or opposed by younger people, and it's older people who are much more in favour. And so Brexit's, whether or not you support independence is now linked to Brexit in a way that was not true in 2014. Secondly, Brexit was much more sharply related to age than independence was in 2014. But put the two things together, and now there is a very sharp relationship between age and independence. And actually in 2014, it was people in their 30s who were most keen on independence, people in their teens, 20s. Yes, they were certainly more keener on people, in their 60s and 70s, but they weren't the most popular group. That's now over. It's now a pretty clear, straight line. The older you are, the more likely you are to be in favour of independence.
John, just lastly from me, in terms of pro-independence parties, do you think we saw the last of Alex Salmond? And on the Electoral Commission, there was a hoo-ha. People were complaining about the Independent Green Voice. I know that we've spoken before about this, that there probably isn't any cause for concern with it because they've been a party for such a long time. Is that correct?
Well, let's take up Alex Salmond. Look, I mean, I think, the honest truth is we've just witnessed something of a personal tragedy. That, unfortunately for Mr. Salmond, although in one instance, i.e. the Scottish Government's handling of the harassment complaints against him, the case was thrown out on procedural grounds, and in the other more serious instance, the criminal charges that were laid against him, the charges were thrown out substantively, and to that extent, at least, it is clear that there is no formal legal stain on Mr. Salmond's character. Unfortunately for him, in the court of public opinion, that is not the position, and that the opinion polls were telling us during the election campaign and beforehand that only around 10–12% of people in Scotland think that Mr. Salmond is now a fit and proper person to hold public office, and indeed they also suggest that for the most part voters were disinclined to believe his side of the case in the disagreement between him and Nicola Sturgeon. And that, therefore, as a result of that, Mr. Salmond is now the most unpopular politician in Scotland. It's very, it's a tragedy. It obviously was a tragedy that his career ended the way that it did in court. It's also, given the incredible contribution that he made to the nationalist movement and to the SNP in Scotland. But I fear that somebody needs to sit him down and say that I'm sorry, but it's all over. And that actually, even for those who wish to maintain a more politically diverse nationalist movement and who wish to continue to challenge the SNP's dominance, it may well be in their interest that Mr. Salmond is no longer leader of Alba, because it's clearly very difficult for people to disentangle those two things. And of course, there were others, before Mr. Salmond came on the scene, particularly Mr. Thompson from the former SNP MSP was also promoting a similar argument. There are those who do believe in a more politically diverse nationalist movement. They're perfectly entitled to their view, but I'm not sure that in the end Mr. Salmond's intervention, although it gave it a lot more publicity, in the end was very helpful to the pursuit of their case, and that therefore probably it is time for Mr. Salmond to move on. And maybe perhaps as a result, it might be possible for us to remember what he achieved and perhaps to forget some of, what he himself ended up having to admit in court was perhaps less than morally at least desirable behaviour that took place on certain occasions when he was Scotland's First Minister.
Just finally for me, John, you've been involved in politics for over 40 years, whether it's studying it or being involved in sort of polling and journalism. Is it something that's challenging to stay so bipartisan and not offer an opinion on events, or is it something that you find quite easy?
Well, I guess I take the very cynical view that it's never true that one side always bears the sword of truth and the other side is always simply selling us a pot of lies. And if that's your disposition, then at least it helps you to be able to see good and bad, weakness and strengths in all sides. And to that extent, at least, I guess I have a disposition that makes it somewhat more possible. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what is also true, perhaps the other thing you certainly have to do, you know, of course I have my own private views. I guess one rule I have is to make sure that in particular, if the evidence you are going to present appears to be consistent with what you would like the world to be like, then make double sure that that indeed is how the world is. Because obviously, like everybody, you know, you are at risk of looking at the world through partisan lenses, and you know, none of us is immune to that. But no, I mean, at the end of the day, what I find fascinating about this process is, you know, is trying to understand what's going on, to understand a lot of the strategy that underlies politics, and to use that in order to come some understanding of, you know, how the parties have comported themselves and how they might do so in future. And, you know, in a sense, I suppose in part, it has a similar kind of fascination to a game of chess, multidimensional, complex players with different powers and different attributes, but where in the end of the day, one side is hoping to achieve victory. But sometimes, of course, we have to declare the game a draw.
John, I think we can all find you on What Scotland Thinks. Is that correct? The blog?
There are two blogs. There's What Scotland Thinks on Scotland and whaUKthinks.org/EU on Brexit. So there are two going on. I am still following the two principal constitutional questions that following the UK, and which still seem to be two important questions in our politics on both sides of the border.
John, thank you very much. We know how busy you are, so a real pleasure to have you on. I'm sure we'll see you on our computer screens, our television screens very shortly. We're that used to computer screens now. But once again, thank you for coming on and joining us on the State of Politics.
Okay, you're welcome. Nice to talk to you.